On September 9, 1513, King James IV of Scotland stood on Branxton Hill in Northumberland, watching 26,000 English soldiers approach across the valley below. James commanded perhaps 30 to 40,000 Scots positioned on the high ground, a strong defensive position that gave every tactical advantage. He had artillery. He had the best-equipped Scottish army ever assembled, with modern pikes, Swiss-style tactics, and experienced French advisors. He had the high ground, forcing the English to attack uphill. By all logic, James should have stayed on Branxton Hill and let the English exhaust themselves attacking his prepared positions. But James IV was not a man who waited defensively. He was a Renaissance warrior king who believed in chivalric combat, personal honor, and leading from the front. He was also impatient, overconfident, and making decisions based on pride rather than tactics. When the English artillery began hitting Scottish positions, and when the Earl of Surrey's English army failed to attack immediately, James made the catastrophic decision to abandon the high ground and advance downhill to force battle. It was one of the worst tactical decisions in Scottish history. The Scottish army descended Branxton Hill in dense pike formations, advancing across muddy ground toward the English. What followed was a slaughter. The English longbowmen and billmen tore apart the Scottish pike blocks. The muddy ground caused Scottish formations to lose cohesion. King James IV, fighting on foot in the front ranks because he believed a king should lead his men personally, was cut down and killed in brutal hand-to-hand combat. By nightfall, perhaps 10,000 to 17,000 Scots lay dead on the field, including the king, 12 earls, 14 lords, an archbishop, 2 bishops, 2 abbots, and the eldest sons of most Scottish noble families. It was the greatest catastrophe in Scottish history, a single afternoon that killed a generation of Scottish leadership, ended Scotland's military power for decades, and left the kingdom orphaned with an infant king. The Battle of Flodden was Scotland's Agincourt, except that instead of defeating an enemy, Scotland destroyed itself through pride, tactical incompetence, and a warrior king who confused bravery with wisdom. On that September afternoon, Scotland bled itself white on English bills and arrows, and the flower of Scottish nobility died in the mud of Northumberland for no strategic gain whatsoever. To understand why the Battle of Flodden was such a catastrophe for Scotland, you must understand the political situation in 1513. England was ruled by King Henry VIII, who had been on the throne since 1509. Henry was young, ambitious, and eager to prove himself as a warrior king by conquering France, which he considered England's natural enemy and rightful possession. In June 1513, Henry personally led an English army to France to besiege French towns and win glory. Scotland was England's traditional enemy to the north, and the two kingdoms had been fighting border wars for centuries. But Scotland and France had the Auld Alliance, a formal treaty dating back to 1295 that committed each to attack England if England attacked the other. When Henry invaded France, the French king Louis XII invoked the alliance and asked King James IV of Scotland to invade northern England to force Henry to withdraw from France. James was legally and strategically obligated to attack England, but he also had personal motivations that would cloud his judgment at Flodden. James was married to Margaret Tudor, Henry VIII's older sister, which theoretically made England and Scotland allies through marriage. But James resented being treated as Henry's subordinate. Henry was younger, wealthier, and more famous, and he treated James with condescension. James wanted to prove himself Henry's equal or superior as a warrior king. Invading England while Henry was in France seemed like an opportunity to win glory, demonstrate Scottish power, and fulfill alliance obligations to France. James IV had been King of Scotland since 1488, when he was 15 years old. He had come to power through rebellion. His father, James III, was killed after being defeated by rebel nobles, and young James had supported the rebellion, a fact that haunted him with guilt for the rest of his life. To atone, James wore an iron belt as penance and was obsessed with proving himself a worthy king. He was intelligent, cultured, and spoke multiple languages. He was genuinely interested in Renaissance learning, technology, and military innovation. He built Scotland's first significant navy. He imported artillery and hired foreign military advisors. He reformed the Scottish army to use modern Swiss-style pike tactics instead of traditional Scottish Highland fighting. He fortified castles and built palaces. He was popular with his subjects and considered one of the more successful Scottish kings. But he had one fatal flaw. He was obsessed with chivalric ideals and personal combat glory. James read medieval romances and believed kings should lead armies personally, fight in the front ranks, and win battles through courage and martial skill. This romantic medievalism was completely at odds with Renaissance military reality, where battles were won through artillery, disciplined formations, and commanders who controlled the battle from positions where they could see the entire field. James's chivalric ideals would kill him and destroy his army. The Scottish invasion of England in August 1513 began successfully. James assembled the largest Scottish army in decades. Estimates range from 30,000 to 40,000 men, though exact numbers are uncertain. This force included approximately 15,000 Highland and Lowland infantry, with pikes trained in Swiss tactics, 5,000 border horsemen, several thousand Highland swordsmen and axemen, French military advisors, and 17 heavy artillery pieces including massive bronze cannon. The artillery train was particularly impressive. Scotland had never fielded such firepower. James also brought most of the Scottish nobility, who were obligated to provide military service. Virtually every major noble family in Scotland sent their leaders and heirs to the army. This concentration of Scottish leadership in one army would prove catastrophic when that army was destroyed. James crossed into England on August 22nd and began besieging English border castles. Norham Castle fell after 5 days of bombardment, a success that reinforced James's confidence in his artillery and army. Other castles surrendered. The invasion seemed to be succeeding, but James moved slowly, besieging castles methodically rather than raiding deep into England. This gave the English time to assemble a response army. The English military response was commanded by Thomas Howard, Earl of Surrey, age 70, a veteran soldier who had fought at Bosworth Field in 1485. Surrey was experienced, cautious, and pragmatic, everything James was not. Henry VIII had left Surrey in charge of defending northern England, while Henry himself campaigned in France. When news came that James had invaded, Surrey assembled an army from northern English levies, retainers, and professional soldiers. Surrey's force numbered approximately 26,000 men, making it smaller than the Scottish army but still substantial. His army included perhaps 5,000 longbowmen, the weapon that had won Crecy and Agincourt, 8,000 billmen armed with English bills, long polearms with hooked blades designed to pull horsemen from saddles and hack through armor, and the rest a mix of men-at-arms, cavalry, and artillery. Surrey's army was experienced in border warfare and led by commanders who had fought Scots before. Most importantly, Surrey understood that defeating the Scots required exploiting their weaknesses: overconfidence, undisciplined charges, and poor coordination between different parts of their army. By early September, Surrey's army had marched north and positioned itself to challenge James. The two armies maneuvered for several days, with James holding strong positions on hills and Surrey unwilling to attack uphill against artillery. Finally, on September 8th, James positioned his army on Branxton Hill, a strong defensive ridge with commanding views of the surrounding country. Surrey's army was in the valley below at Barmore. The tactical situation favored James completely. He had the high ground. His artillery could fire downhill at the English. If Surrey attacked uphill, the Scots would cut the English to pieces. Surrey knew this and tried to maneuver around the Scottish position, marching his army east and then north, crossing the Till River to approach Branxton Hill from a different direction. This maneuver was risky. Surrey was dividing his army temporarily and crossing a river in the presence of the enemy, both dangerous moves. But James did nothing. Scottish military advisors urged James to attack the English while they were vulnerable crossing the river. James refused, either because he was waiting for the English to attack him, or because he was being too cautious, or because he misunderstood the tactical situation. This was James's first major mistake. He let Surrey complete a dangerous maneuver unopposed. By the afternoon of September 9th, Surrey's English army had successfully crossed the Till and was positioned north of Branxton Hill, facing south toward the Scottish positions. James was still on the high ground, but now the English were approaching from a different direction than he expected. Surrey deployed his army in several divisions. The vanguard, commanded by his son Thomas Howard, the younger, the center under Surrey himself, and the rear under other commanders. The English artillery began firing at the Scottish positions. This bombardment was not particularly effective. English artillery in 1513 was less powerful than Scottish guns, but it was hitting Scottish positions and causing some casualties. More importantly, it was insulting. James, who prided himself on his superior artillery, was being bombarded and could not effectively respond because his guns were positioned for a different approach. The combination of English artillery fire, the frustration of seeing Surrey successfully maneuver, and James's impatience led to the fatal decision. Rather than staying on Branxton Hill and forcing the English to attack uphill, James ordered his army to advance downhill and attack the English. This decision baffled his French military advisors and surprised his own commanders. They had spent the previous week waiting on strong defensive positions. Now, with the battle finally at hand on favorable ground, James was throwing away every advantage. But James was the king, and his orders were obeyed. The Scottish advance down Branxton Hill began in the late afternoon. James organized his army into 4 or 5 large divisions, each composed of thousands of pikemen in dense Swiss-style formations. These pike blocks were supposed to be disciplined, tight formations that moved as units with 16 to 18-foot-long pikes pointed forward, creating a wall of spear points that was nearly invulnerable to cavalry and effective against infantry. Swiss pikemen had dominated European battlefields for decades using these tactics. James believed his army, trained by French advisors in Swiss methods and equipped with modern pikes, would crush the English through shock and discipline. But several factors undermined this plan. First, the ground between Branxton Hill and the English positions was muddy and uneven from recent rain. Moving dense pike formations across muddy ground was difficult and caused formations to lose cohesion. Second, the Scottish pike blocks were not actually as well trained or disciplined as Swiss mercenaries. Many Scottish soldiers were farmers and townsmen with minimal training, trying to execute sophisticated tactics they didn't fully understand. Third, the English were not passive targets waiting to be overwhelmed. They had longbowmen who could shoot into pike blocks from a distance, and billmen who were specifically trained to fight against pikes using shorter, more maneuverable weapons. As the Scottish pike divisions advanced downhill, English longbowmen began shooting. 5,000 English archers released arrows into the approaching Scottish formations. The range was close enough, perhaps 100 to 200 yards, that arrows punched through armor and killed or wounded men in the pike blocks. Scottish casualties mounted, but the Scots kept advancing. Dense pike formations could absorb arrow fire if they maintained discipline and closed quickly with the enemy. The real disaster began when the Scottish pike blocks reached the English lines. The muddy ground had caused Scottish formations to become disordered. The pike blocks, which needed to stay tight to be effective, had stretched and fragmented crossing the mud. Gaps had opened. Men were out of position. When they hit the English billmen, the Scots discovered that their long pikes were less effective than expected in close combat. The 18-foot pikes required space to maneuver. In tight, chaotic melee, they became unwieldy. The English bills, which were shorter polearms with hooked blades, were brutal close combat weapons. Billmen could hook Scottish pikes and pull them aside, opening gaps. They could hook armor and pull soldiers out of formation. They could chop with the blade like a halberd. In close quarters fighting, the English bills destroyed Scottish pikes. The battle devolved into multiple separate melees across the field as different Scottish and English divisions engaged. On the Scottish right flank, the Highland Division made initial progress, pushing back English troops. But this success was not exploited, because other Scottish divisions were struggling. In the center, where King James himself fought, the melee was vicious. James had positioned himself with the main pike division, intending to lead from the front. When the division engaged English troops, James dismounted from his horse, as chivalric honor dictated kings should fight on foot alongside their men, and entered the melee with his bodyguard. This was tactically insane. A king's job in battle was to command the army, respond to developments, coordinate divisions, and make strategic decisions. None of this could be done while fighting in the front rank of a chaotic hand-to-hand melee. But James believed a warrior king should fight personally. He waded into combat with a pike or sword, his bodyguard around him, fighting English billmen. For a time, James held his own. He was a strong man in good armor. But he was also 40 years old, and in the middle of a brutal slaughter. Somewhere in that melee, surrounded by English soldiers who didn't even realize they were fighting the Scottish king, James IV was struck down and killed. The exact details are uncertain. Different accounts say he was killed by arrows, by a bill, by multiple wounds. What is certain is that he died fighting on foot in the front ranks, and his death was not immediately known because he was one of thousands of armored men fighting in the mud and chaos. The death of the king, even though not immediately recognized, began to affect the Scottish army. James's division, already struggling against English billmen, began to lose cohesion. Other Scottish divisions, seeing the center in trouble, tried to help but became disordered themselves. The battle was spreading across a wide area in failing light. It was now late afternoon moving toward evening. Visibility was poor. Command and control were impossible. The Scottish army, which had started the battle with numerical superiority and had charged downhill with confidence, was now fragmented into separate fights, exhausted, taking heavy casualties, and increasingly demoralized. The English, fighting defensively with weapons suited to the terrain and combat style, held their ground. The battle became a slaughter. Scottish pike formations that had lost cohesion were surrounded and butchered. Scots trying to retreat were shot by archers or cut down by cavalry. The Scottish Highland Division on the right, which had been winning, found itself isolated and eventually had to withdraw. By nightfall, the Battle of Flodden was over. The Scottish army was in full retreat, leaving thousands of dead on the field. The casualty figures at Flodden were catastrophic for Scotland. Contemporary sources vary, but most agree that between 10,000 and 17,000 Scots were killed, with some estimates even higher. Given that the Scottish army numbered 30,000 to 40,000, this represents 25 to 56% casualties, one of the highest proportional losses in any medieval battle. English casualties were estimated at 1,000 to 4,000, significantly lower. But the Scottish casualties were not just numbers. They represented the destruction of Scottish military and political leadership. King James IV was dead. 12 earls were dead, nearly the entire Scottish nobility. 14 lords, an archbishop, 2 bishops, 2 abbots, and the eldest sons of most major families. The French ambassador to Scotland died. Virtually every noble family in Scotland lost someone at Flodden. Many lost multiple members. The devastation was so complete that Scottish historians later called it, "The flowers of the forest are a weed away," referring to the young men who died. Scotland lost a generation of leadership in one afternoon. The new king, James V, was just 17 months old. Scotland would be ruled by regents for years, leading to political instability. The Scottish military was destroyed and would not recover for decades. Flodden was Scotland's greatest catastrophe. The immediate aftermath of Flodden was confusion and horror. The Scottish army fled north, pursued by English cavalry for a distance. Bodies covered the battlefield, so many that English forces couldn't bury them all. King James's body was eventually identified among the dead, stripped of armor like other corpses. His body was taken to England and eventually sent to London, where it was held unburied for years because James had been excommunicated by the Pope for breaking peace with England, and technically should not receive Christian burial. This added humiliation to tragedy. In Scotland, news of the disaster spread slowly. At first there were rumors that James had survived, but eventually, the truth became clear. The king was dead, the nobility was destroyed, the army was annihilated. Edinburgh prepared for English invasion, strengthening walls that would become known as the Flodden Wall. But England, exhausted from the battle, and with Henry VIII still in France, did not invade. The English were content with having destroyed Scotland as a military threat for a generation. The strategic consequences of Flodden were profound. Scotland's military power was broken. For decades after, Scotland could not threaten England militarily and became vulnerable to English raids. The political instability caused by infant King James V being under regency control led to internal conflicts and manipulation by foreign powers. The loss of so much nobility created succession disputes and power vacuums. The Catholic Church in Scotland was weakened by the deaths of senior clergy, contributing to the Scottish Reformation later. And perhaps most importantly, Flodden ended the illusion that Scotland could compete with England militarily. The vast disparity in resources, population, and wealth between the two kingdoms meant that Scotland's only viable strategy was defensive survival, not aggressive warfare. Flodden proved this brutally. James IV's invasion of England had been strategically pointless. Even if he had won at Flodden, he could not have conquered England or forced Henry to withdraw from France. The invasion achieved nothing except to destroy Scotland's army and leadership. It was a catastrophic waste. The military lessons of Flodden were clear, but often misunderstood. Many later accounts blamed Scottish pike tactics or equipment, but the real failures were tactical and strategic. James's decision to abandon the high ground and attack downhill was inexplicable. He threw away every defensive advantage for no reason except impatience and pride. His decision to fight personally in the front rank was equally disastrous. Kings who fought in battles typically commanded from positions where they could see and control the action. James's death in melee demonstrated the stupidity of confusing personal bravery with military competence. The Scottish Army's lack of coordination between divisions was another failure. Units fought separately rather than supporting each other. And the muddy ground, which Scottish commanders should have anticipated given recent weather, destroyed pike formations that required firm ground to function. All these failures were avoidable with better leadership. Surrey's English army, though smaller, was better commanded, used weapons suited to the conditions, and exploited Scottish mistakes ruthlessly. The human cost of Flodden was measured not just in the dead, but in the families destroyed. Virtually every Scottish noble family lost fathers, sons, or brothers. The widows and orphans of Flodden became a symbol of national tragedy. Entire villages lost their men. The Scottish economy, already poor, was devastated by the loss of so many farmers and craftsmen. The psychological trauma affected Scotland for generations. Flodden became the defining disaster in Scottish national memory, worse even than later defeats, because it was so unnecessary and so devastating. Scottish culture produced elegies, poems, and songs mourning the dead. The Flowers of the Forest, a lament written in the 18th century about Flodden, remains one of Scotland's most famous sad songs. The battle became a warning about the dangers of pride, bad leadership, and unnecessary wars. But the lessons were not always learned. Scotland would continue to suffer from poor leadership and strategic mistakes for centuries. On September 9, 1513, King James IV of Scotland abandoned a strong defensive position on Branxton Hill and ordered his 30,000 to 40,000 men to attack downhill across muddy ground toward 26,000 English soldiers. The Scottish pike formations became disordered in the mud. English longbowmen shot them down. English billmen tore apart the pike blocks in brutal close-quarters combat. James himself, fighting on foot in the front ranks like a medieval knight instead of commanding like a Renaissance king, was cut down and killed in the melee. By nightfall, perhaps 10,000 to 17,000 Scots were dead, including the king, 12 earls, 14 lords, an archbishop, 2 bishops, 2 abbots, and the eldest sons of most Scottish noble families. It was the greatest catastrophe in Scottish history, a generation of leadership destroyed in one afternoon through pride, tactical stupidity, and a warrior king who confused bravery with wisdom. The flowers of the forest were wed away, the blood of Scotland stained Northumberland, and the kingdom orphaned with an infant king would spend decades recovering from one afternoon of slaughter. Flodden was Scotland's self-inflicted wound. The battle that proved courage without tactics is just suicide. And the day Scotland learned that chivalric ideals are no match for bills, bows, and competent commanders. In the mud of Branxton Hill, Scottish nobility died for nothing, and Scotland's military power died with them.